For 36 years, I convinced myself that if I just tried harder, my family would finally see me. I was wrong. The moment my sister Samantha grabbed my arm and pulled me toward her boss at her wedding reception, I should have known something cruel was coming. The champagne glasses clinked around us. The string quartet played softly, and my sister's smile, that familiar, razor-sharp smile, told me everything. "Mr. Halden," she announced, her voice carrying across the crowd. "This is my sister Kimberly, the embarrassment of our family." Laughter erupted. My parents, my relatives, even strangers who didn't know my name. My father nodded, still chuckling. "Yeah, we stopped expecting much from her years ago." I stood frozen. The heat crawled up my neck. My hands trembled at my sides. But Mr. Halden didn't laugh. He studied my sister with an expression I couldn't read. The air grew heavy. Conversations died. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Then he smiled faintly and said 5 words that shattered my sister's perfect day. "Have you ever been publicly humiliated by the people who were supposed to love you most?" My name is Kimberly Arnold. I'm 36 years old, and I work as an independent financial consultant for small businesses. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest. And I've built my career one client at a time without asking anyone for help. I've always been the quiet one in my family. The one who didn't need attention, didn't cause problems, didn't ask for much. At least that's what my parents always said. "Kimberly can take care of herself," my mother would tell relatives at family gatherings. "It's Samantha who needs the opportunities. She's ambitious. She's going places." Samantha is my younger sister by 3 years, and for as long as I can remember, she's been the sun around which our entire family orbits. I live alone in a small apartment about 3 hours from my hometown. I like my peaceful life. I enjoy my morning coffee by the window, my evening walks through the park, and the satisfaction of helping struggling business owners find their footing. 10 years ago, I helped an older gentleman save his furniture store from bankruptcy. He reminded me of my grandfather, so I did all the work for free and never mentioned it to anyone. That's just who I am. I don't need applause. I just need to know I did something good. But my family has never seen it that way. Growing up, I remember overhearing my parents discuss something called Grandpa's Education Fund. He'd apparently set aside money for both Samantha and me before he passed. When I asked about it years later, my mother waved her hand dismissively. "There wasn't much left, honey. Don't worry about it." I never asked again. I learned early that asking questions in my family only led to disappointment. When Samantha announced her engagement to Michael Bennett, I was genuinely happy for her. Michael seemed kind, soft-spoken, the type of man who listened more than he talked. I hoped he would be good for her. And when Samantha called me 3 months before the wedding asking for a little help with some small tasks, I said yes without hesitation. That's what sisters do. What I didn't expect was that small tasks meant negotiating with florists who'd overcharged by $800, advancing $2,000 of my own money when the venue deposit was due, and Samantha forgot her checkbook and spending countless evenings solving problems that no one else wanted to handle. When the wedding planner quit 2 weeks before the event, I was the one who stepped in. My parents praised Samantha endlessly. "She's so organized," my mother gushed. "She's handling everything beautifully." Not once did they mention my name. Only Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister, seemed to notice. At the rehearsal dinner, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "I see everything you do, sweetheart, even if they don't." I smiled and said nothing. I'd learned long ago that expecting recognition from my family was like expecting rain in a drought. On the day of the wedding, I arrived early to help with last-minute arrangements. I set up centerpieces, guided elderly guests to their seats, and made sure the caterers had everything they needed. When it was time to sit down, I discovered my assigned seat was at a corner table near the kitchen, surrounded by distant relatives whose names I barely remembered. From across the room, I spotted Richard Halden at the VIP table beside my parents, Samantha's boss. She talked about him constantly, how powerful he was, how important his approval was to her career. Something about his face seemed strangely familiar, but I couldn't place it. I also watched Michael standing near the dance floor, looking slightly uncomfortable whenever Samantha mentioned our family dynamics to guests. He caught my eye once and looked away quickly, almost apologetically. The reception was in full swing when Samantha found me. She grabbed my arm with that bright camera-ready smile, her fingers pressing a little too hard into my skin. "Come with me," she said. "Mr. Halden wants to meet everyone important." She pulled me through the crowd toward the VIP table, her grip never loosening. "Mr. Halden," Samantha announced, her voice carrying above the music. "Let me introduce you to someone special." Samantha paused for dramatic effect, her smile widening as she gestured toward me like I was some kind of exhibit. "This is my sister Kimberly, the embarrassment of our family." She laughed high and sharp. "Still single, still working some small job nobody understands. We keep hoping she'll figure her life out eventually." The words hit me like a slap across the face. My father chuckled from his seat, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, we stopped expecting much from her years ago." My mother covered her mouth, giggling as though Samantha had just told the funniest joke. A few guests nearby laughed awkwardly, unsure whether to join in or look away. Most chose to join in. I stood there, frozen, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. The heat crept up my neck and burned in my cheeks. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and never be seen again. But I had learned long ago how to survive these moments. I kept my face neutral, my breathing steady, and I said nothing. What I noticed, though, was that Richard Halden did not laugh. He sat perfectly still, his champagne glass untouched, watching the scene with an expression I couldn't quite read. His eyes moved from Samantha to my parents, then settled on me. There was no pity in his gaze, no amusement, just something quiet and observant, like he was taking mental notes. "Kimberly," he said, his voice cutting through the lingering laughter. "What kind of consulting do you do?" I blinked, surprised that he was speaking to me at all. "Financial consulting," I managed. "For small businesses, I help them restructure, manage cash flow, avoid bankruptcy when things get difficult." He nodded slowly. "How long have you been doing that?" "About 12 years now." "Interesting." He turned to look at Samantha, and the warmth drained from his face entirely. His expression became cold, almost clinical. "Very interesting." He set down his glass and stood. "Samantha, we need to talk first thing Monday morning. Enjoy the rest of your evening." Without another word, he walked away from the table and headed toward the exit. The silence that followed was deafening. Samantha's smile faltered, confusion flickering in her eyes. My parents exchanged uncertain glances. No one seemed to understand what had just happened. I caught Michael watching me from across the room. His face was tight with discomfort, and when our eyes met, he looked away quickly, almost ashamed. He said nothing. He did nothing. But I could tell he had seen everything. I left the reception early, claiming I had a headache. No one tried to stop me. 3 days later, my phone exploded with calls and messages. Samantha had been placed on paid administrative leave pending an internal investigation. She was hysterical, sobbing into the phone when she called our mother. By the end of the week, the investigation concluded, and she was officially terminated. My parents called me that same evening, and their voices were sharp with accusation. "What did you say to him?" my mother demanded. "What did you tell that man at the wedding?" "I didn't say anything," I replied, genuinely confused. "He asked me about my job. That's all." "You must have said something," my father cut in. "Samantha lost her job because of you. You've always been jealous of her. You finally found a way to sabotage her." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For 36 years, I had done nothing but support my sister stay out of her way and accept whatever scraps of attention my family decided to throw my way. And now, when something happened that had nothing to do with me, I was somehow the villain. "I didn't do anything," I said quietly. "I don't know why he fired her." "Of course you did," my mother snapped. "You've been waiting for this your whole life." She hung up before I could respond. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the ceiling as the hours crept by. I thought about every birthday where Samantha's gifts were bigger and better, every holiday where my achievements were ignored while hers were celebrated, every time I had reached out for connection and been pushed aside. I thought about the $800 I saved them on flowers they never thanked me for, the $2,000 I advanced that was never repaid, the countless hours I spent making sure Samantha's wedding was perfect while being seated next to the kitchen like an afterthought. And I asked myself a question I had never allowed myself to ask before. Why do I keep trying to prove myself to people who refuse to see me? The answer came slowly, painfully, but with absolute clarity. I had spent my entire life seeking approval from people who had decided long ago that I wasn't worth their attention. I had bent myself into shapes trying to fit into a family that had never made room for me. And no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough for them. Because the problem was never me. Something shifted inside me that night. A door closed that I had been holding open for 36 years. I made a decision, quiet but firm. I would stop waiting for my family to love me the way I deserved. I would stop apologizing for existing. From now on, I would live for myself, not for their approval. The following Monday, I arrived at my small office ready to start fresh. But when I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a luxury car already parked outside. The door opened and a familiar figure stepped out. It was Richard Halden, and this time he was carrying a thick folder. Richard Halden walked toward me with the kind of calm confidence that comes from years of experience. I stood by my office door completely bewildered, trying to understand why one of the most successful executives in the region was standing in my tiny parking lot on a Monday morning. "Ms. Arnold," he said, nodding politely. "I apologize for showing up unannounced. Do you have a few minutes?" I unlocked the door and led him inside. My office was small, just a desk, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with financial books and client files. Nothing impressive. But Richard looked around with what seemed like genuine respect. "This is where you work," he said more to himself than to me. 12 years of helping small businesses, all from this little office. "It's not much," I admitted, "but it's mine." He smiled, and for the first time I saw warmth in his expression. "Ms. Arnold, do you remember a furniture store in Hartford about 10 years ago? A place called Weston's Fine Furniture?" The name hit me like a wave. I hadn't thought about that store in years. "I remember," I said slowly. "The owner was an older gentleman. He was about to lose everything." Richard set the folder on my desk and looked me straight in the eyes. "That older gentleman was me." I stared at him, unable to speak. 10 years ago," he continued, "I owned that store. It had been in my family for 2 generations, and I was about to become the one who lost it. I was drowning in debt, making every wrong decision, watching everything my father built slip through my fingers. And then a young woman walked in. She was fresh out of college, couldn't have been more than 25 or 26. She took one look at my books and told me exactly what I was doing wrong. My heart was pounding. I remembered that day. I remembered his tired eyes, the desperation in his voice, the way he reminded me so much of my grandfather. "She helped me restructure everything," Richard said. "She spent weeks working on my finances completely free of charge. When I asked her why, she said I reminded her of her grandfather. She never even told me her full name, just called herself Kim." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I sold that store 3 years later for a profit," he continued. "I used that money to go back to school, get my MBA, and build the career I have now. Everything I've accomplished in the last decade started with that moment. I've been looking for Kim ever since." He paused. "When your sister introduced you at the wedding, when she called you the embarrassment of the family, I knew immediately who you were. And I knew exactly what kind of person your sister really is." I sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the weight of what he was telling me. Richard opened the folder and spread several documents across my desk. "I didn't fire Samantha because of what she said at the wedding," he explained. "I've been investigating her for 6 months. She falsified reports to hide departmental losses. She took credit for work done by her colleagues. She used company email for suspicious personal transactions. The wedding incident simply confirmed what I already suspected. She's willing to step on anyone to get ahead, including her own sister." I looked at the documents, seeing Samantha's name on reports, flagged for inconsistencies, emails, marked as evidence a timeline of her deception stretching back over a year. "I'm telling you this," Richard said, "because I want to offer you a position, not as an employee that would create a conflict of interest given your family connection, but as an independent consultant on a major restructuring project. Your skills saved my business once. I'd like to see what you can do with proper resources." I didn't know what to say. After everything that had happened, this felt almost impossible to believe. Richard stood to leave, but paused at the door. "One more thing," he said carefully. During the investigation, I noticed some unusual patterns in Samantha's personal finances, things that didn't connect to the company but seemed strange. I can't access private records, and it's not my place to dig deeper. But if I were you, I'd look into any shared family accounts. Sometimes the patterns we find at work reflect patterns at home. He left without another word. For 2 days, his warning haunted me. Shared family accounts. Patterns at home. I kept thinking about my grandfather's education fund, the one my mother had dismissed so easily years ago. Finally, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I contacted the bank where my grandfather had held his accounts and requested historical records as a legal heir. The documents arrived by secure email 3 days later. What I found made my hands shake. The education fund had held $80,000 split equally between Samantha and me, $40,000 each. But 15 years ago, the entire amount designated for me had been withdrawn. The authorization form bore 2 signatures, my mother's and my father's. The funds had been transferred directly into Samantha's personal account. $40,000, my inheritance, stolen by my own parents and given to my sister. That was why Samantha graduated debt-free, while I spent 8 years paying off student loans. That was why my parents always said there wasn't much left. That was why they had favored her so relentlessly, because they owed her their loyalty in exchange for their guilt. 36 years of being called the embarrassment. 36 years of being told I wasn't good enough. And all along they had been stealing from me. I sat in my office as the sun set outside my window, the bank records spread before me, like evidence of a crime. And in many ways, that's exactly what they were. I picked up my phone and dialed Richard's number. When he answered, my voice was steady. "I'm in," I said, "but I need access to everything." Richard gave me full access to the investigation files, and over the next 2 months, I worked as an independent consultant, reviewing every document, every transaction, every discrepancy that had been flagged. It was meticulous work, but I approached it the same way I approached every project, with honesty, fairness, and attention to detail. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth. What I didn't expect was for Samantha to make everything worse for herself. About 6 weeks into the investigation, my phone rang. It was my sister, and her voice was sweeter than I had ever heard it. "Kimberly, hi, it's me. Listen, I know things have been difficult between us, but I need your help. Just tell them you helped me with some of those reports. Okay, you're good with numbers. They'll believe you. We're family after all." I held the phone in silence for a moment, genuinely stunned by her audacity. "Samantha, I'm not going to lie for you." Her sweetness evaporated instantly. "You owe me," she hissed. "After everything I've done for you, after all the times I included you in my life, you owe me this." I hung up without another word. 2 weeks later, the IT department made a discovery that sealed Samantha's fate. She had created a series of emails designed to look like they came from me. Emails that supposedly showed me advising her on how to manipulate the financial reports. It was clever, I'll admit, but she made one critical mistake. Every single email was created from her own computer on dates when I was in another city, entirely working with clients who could verify my location. The timestamps, the IP addresses, everything pointed directly back to her. What had started as financial fraud had now become forgery and attempted defamation. Around that same time, I received an unexpected message. It was from Michael, Samantha's husband. He asked if we could meet privately somewhere away from the family. I agreed, curious but cautious. We met at a quiet coffee shop near my office. Michael looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there at the wedding. He sat across from me and let out a long breath before speaking. "I'm starting to see who Samantha really is," he said quietly. "The way she treated you at the wedding, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just sibling rivalry, that every family has drama. But recently I found out she used the money from our wedding gifts to pay off personal debts she never told me about. Thousands of dollars gone without a single conversation." I listened without interrupting. "I should have said something that night," he continued. "When she humiliated you in front of everyone, I saw your face. I saw how much it hurt, and I just stood there like a coward." He looked me in the eyes. "I'm sorry, Kimberly. I'm truly sorry." It was the first time anyone connected to my family had ever apologized to me. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded and thanked him for his honesty. For the first time in months, I felt like someone outside my own head could see the truth. The company hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning. I presented my independent audit report to the board, walking them through each finding with calm precision. I was careful to separate what Samantha had clearly done wrong from what might have been circumstantial or unclear. I wasn't there to destroy her. I was there to present facts. The board deliberated for less than an hour. Their decision was unanimous permanent termination, $28,000 in restitution for the losses she had caused, and a formal record in the industry database that would follow her for years. Richard explained to me privately that the company had chosen an internal settlement to avoid a public scandal. Samantha had signed an agreement not to sue in exchange for no criminal charges being filed. It was over, at least professionally, but I still had one conversation left to have. That evening, I called my parents. My father answered, and I asked him to put me on speaker so my mother could hear too. "I know about grandfather's education fund," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I know it held $80,000 split equally between Samantha and me. I know that 15 years ago my $40,000 was withdrawn with both of your signatures and transferred directly to Samantha." The silence on the other end was deafening. My mother finally spoke, her voice shaky. "Kimberly, you have to understand. Samantha needed opportunities. She had expenses, she had plans. We were going to pay you back eventually." 15 years, I replied. "I spent 8 years paying off student loans while Samantha graduated debt-free. You told me there wasn't much left in the fund. You lied to my face." "We were trying to help her," my father added weakly. "And what about helping me?" I asked. "Did that ever occur to either of you?" Neither of them had an answer. "I don't need the money back," I said finally. "I built my life without it, and I'll keep building. But I needed you to know that I finally know the truth, and I need you to understand that things between us will never be the same." I ended the call before they could respond. 3 weeks passed. I focused on my work on the new projects Richard had brought me, on rebuilding a sense of peace in my life. Then one evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from Aunt Margaret. "Sweetheart, there's something I need to tell you." And I think it's time the whole family heard it too. Aunt Margaret's message stayed with me for days. I read it over and over, wondering what she could possibly want to tell me that required the whole family to hear. She had always been the quiet observer, the one who noticed things others missed, but rarely spoke up about them. For her to break that silence now meant something significant was about to change. When my parents called a week later to invite me to a family dinner, my first instinct was to decline. I had said everything I needed to say to them. I had made my boundaries clear, but then Aunt Margaret called me separately, her voice gentle but insistent. "Please come, sweetheart," she said. "I know things have been difficult, but there's something I've been carrying for a very long time, and I think it's finally time to let it out. You deserve to be there when I do." So I went, not for my parents, not for Samantha, but for the woman who had always seen me when no one else bothered to look. The dinner was held at my parents' house, the same house where I had grown up, feeling like a ghost in my own family. The dining room was filled with relatives I hadn't seen in months, aunts and uncles and cousins, whose conversations flowed easily around the long table. I took my seat near the end, noticing how some of them glanced at me with curiosity, while others avoided eye contact entirely. Word had spread about Samantha's termination and the investigation that followed. I knew that many of them had already decided I was somehow to blame. Samantha wasn't there. My mother mentioned quietly that she had refused to come, claiming she wasn't feeling well. I suspected the real reason was shame or perhaps anger or some complicated mixture of both. The meal progressed like any other family gathering, filled with small talk and forced laughter and the clinking of silverware against plates. I stayed quiet, eating slowly, wondering when Aunt Margaret would make her move. Then, halfway through dessert, she pushed back her chair and stood up. The conversations around the table gradually died down as everyone turned to look at her. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice calm but carrying an authority I had never heard from her before, "and I need all of you to listen." My mother's face tightened with concern. My father set down his fork and stared at his sister-in-law with confusion. The room fell completely silent. "For 36 years," Aunt Margaret began, "I have watched this family treat Kimberly like she doesn't exist. like she's somehow less important, less worthy of love and attention than her younger sister. I've watched her be overlooked at every birthday, every holiday, every milestone. I've watched her work twice as hard for half the recognition, and I've said nothing because I didn't want to cause conflict, because I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room. But I can't stay silent anymore, not after everything that's happened. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what she was about to say. Let me tell you about the niece this family has ignored for 36 years, Aunt Margaret continued. 8 years ago, I was diagnosed with a serious heart condition. The surgery was expensive, and the medical bills nearly destroyed me. I was drowning in debt, too proud and too ashamed to ask anyone for help. I thought I would lose my house. Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. And then one day I received a letter from the hospital saying my entire balance had been paid. $8,000 cleared completely. I spent 2 years trying to figure out who had done it, and when I finally found out, do you know who it was? She looked directly at me, her eyes glistening with tears. It was Kimberly. She paid off my debt without saying a single word. She never asked for thanks. She never even told me. She just saw that I was suffering and decided to help. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. I felt my face flush with heat. I had never wanted anyone to know about that. It wasn't about recognition. It was simply the right thing to do. And that's not the only thing, Aunt Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. When my son Daniel was applying for college scholarships, he was struggling with his essays and interviews. Kimberly spent weeks helping him, staying up late to edit his applications, coaching him through every step of the process. She did all of this while she was still paying off her own student loans she had to take because her share of her grandfather's education fund was stolen from her. She let those words hang in the air. Daniel got that scholarship. He graduated debt-free, and Kimberly never asked for anything in return. Not a thank you, not a mention, nothing. My mother was sobbing quietly now, her napkin pressed against her face. My father stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Around the room, relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the weight of Aunt Margaret's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. This is the woman you've called the embarrassment of the family, Aunt Margaret concluded, her voice breaking with emotion. This is the woman you've dismissed and overlooked for her entire life. And I think it's time every single one of you took a good hard look at who she really is, Zhuang. She sat down, and the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in 36 years, my family actually saw me. The months that followed brought changes none of us could have predicted. Samantha's carefully constructed life fell apart piece by piece. She was forced to sell her new car to pay the $28,000 in restitution the company required. Her industry record made it nearly impossible to find work in her field, and after months of searching, she finally accepted a low-level administrative position at a small firm that didn't conduct thorough background checks. The salary was a fraction of what she had earned before. Michael filed for legal separation, telling her he needed time to decide whether he could trust her again. The golden child who had always had everything suddenly found herself with almost nothing. 5 months after the wedding, Samantha appeared at my office unannounced. I barely recognized her when she walked through the door. She looked thinner, exhausted, her designer clothes replaced by something simple and worn. The confidence that had always radiated from her was gone, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I nodded and gestured to the chair across from my desk. She sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "I always thought you were weak," she admitted, "because you never fought back, because you let people say terrible things about you and never defended yourself. I thought being quiet meant you didn't have the strength to stand up for yourself." She finally looked up at me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But I was wrong. You weren't weak. You were stronger than me all along. You just didn't need to prove it to anyone." I sat in silence, letting her words settle between us. "I'm sorry," she continued, her voice cracking, "for the wedding. For what I said in front of everyone, for taking your inheritance, for every time I made you feel like you weren't enough. I know sorry doesn't fix anything. I know I can't undo what I did, but I needed you to know that I finally understand." I took a deep breath. Thank you for saying that, I replied. I'm not ready to forgive you yet. Maybe someday I will. But thank you for being honest with me. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and left without another word. 3 weeks later, my parents invited me to dinner, just the three of us. We sat at the kitchen table, where I had eaten thousands of meals growing up, and for a while nobody spoke. Then my father cleared his throat, his voice trembling with emotion. I always thought you were strong enough not to need us, he said. You never complained. You never asked for anything. I told myself that meant you were fine. But I was wrong, Kimberly. I failed you as a father. My mother reached for my hand, tears streaming down her face. I focused on Samantha because she reminded me of myself when I was young, she said. Ambitious, but reckless, always making mistakes. I thought if I protected her enough, she wouldn't end up failing like I almost did. But in trying to save her, I forgot about you. I forgot that you needed me too. I listened to their words, feeling the weight of 36 years pressing against my chest. Part of me wanted to release all the anger I had carried for so long, but I knew that wouldn't heal anything. I need time, I said finally. I can't pretend everything is fine just because you apologized, but I'm willing to try as long as we treat each other as equals from now on. They nodded, and for the first time I believed they meant it. 8 months after the wedding, Richard and I officially launched our program, supporting women over 40 who were rebuilding their lives. Michael remained a friend, grateful for my example of integrity. And when a card arrived from my parents congratulating me on my new venture, I smiled, not because I needed their approval, but because I no longer depended on it. I spent 36 years trying to prove I was worthy of their love. Now I live to prove I'm worthy of my own. And that is the greatest victory of all. Looking back on everything that happened, I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if Richard Halden had never walked into that wedding reception. Would I still be the invisible daughter working quietly in the background while my family celebrated someone else? Would I still be waiting for an apology that might never have come? Would I still be measuring my worth by whether or not my parents remembered to call on my birthday? The truth is, I don't know. And maybe that's the point. For 36 years, I lived in the shadow of my younger sister. I watched her receive the praise, the attention, the opportunities that I was told I didn't need. I absorbed every dismissive comment, every eye roll, every moment of being overlooked, and I convinced myself that if I just tried a little harder, loved a little more, gave a little more of myself, eventually they would see me. Eventually they would understand that I was worthy of their love too. But here's what I learned through all of this. You cannot earn love from people who have already decided not to give it. You cannot prove your worth to people who refuse to see it. And you certainly cannot build your self-esteem on a foundation of someone else's approval, because that foundation will always be unstable, always shifting beneath your feet, always threatening to collapse the moment they decide to look away. The hardest part of my journey wasn't confronting my sister or facing my parents with the truth about the inheritance. The hardest part was looking in the mirror and admitting that I had spent my entire adult life seeking validation from people who were never going to give it to me. I had made their opinions the measure of my success, their attention, the proof of my value, their love, the goal I was constantly chasing but never quite reaching. When I finally stopped chasing, something remarkable happened. I found myself. I found the woman who had quietly helped an elderly stranger save his business without expecting anything in return. I found the woman who had paid off her aunt's medical debt and never mentioned it to anyone. I found the woman who had helped her cousin get a scholarship while still struggling with her own financial burdens. That woman had been there all along, doing good work, living with integrity, making a difference in the lives of others. She just hadn't recognized her own value because she was too busy looking for it in other people's eyes. My family will never be perfect. The scars from 36 years of being overlooked don't disappear overnight just because someone finally says they're sorry. Healing takes time. Trust has to be rebuilt slowly, carefully, with consistent actions rather than empty words. I'm still learning how to have a relationship with my parents that doesn't leave me feeling diminished. I'm still figuring out what forgiveness looks like when the wounds run so deep, and I'm still discovering what it means to love myself enough that I no longer need anyone else's permission to feel worthy. But I can tell you this, the freedom that comes from living your own life on your own terms, without constantly seeking approval from people who withheld it for decades, is unlike anything I have ever experienced. It's not about revenge or bitterness or proving them wrong. It's about finally, after all these years, proving yourself right. It's about looking at your reflection and knowing deep in your bones that you are enough, that you have always been enough, that their inability to see your worth was never a reflection of who you are, only a reflection of who they chose to be. If you're listening to this story and something in it feels familiar, if you know what it's like to be the overlooked child, the forgotten friend, the invisible partner who gives and never seems to receive, I want you to know that you are not alone. So many of us have walked this path. So many of us have spent years, sometimes decades, trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it freely. And so many of us have finally reached that breaking point where we realize that the only approval we truly need is our own. I don't know where you are in your journey. Maybe you're still in the thick of it, still hoping that this time will be different, still believing that if you just try a little harder, they'll finally see you. Or maybe you've already started to pull away to build boundaries to protect yourself from the constant disappointment of unmet expectations. Or maybe, like me, you've reached the other side and you're learning what it feels like to live without that weight on your shoulders. Wherever you are, I hope my story has given you something. Comfort, maybe, recognition, or perhaps just the simple knowledge that someone else understands what you've been through. I would love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own experiences with family, with feeling invisible, with finally finding your voice, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me about your journey. Tell me about the moment you realized your worth didn't depend on someone else's opinion. Tell me about the person who finally saw you when everyone else looked away. Or tell me about the struggle you're still facing, the hope you're still holding on to, the healing you're still working toward. We are stronger when we share our stories. We are braver when we know we're not alone. If this is your first time listening to our channel, I invite you to subscribe and join our community. Every week we share stories like this one. Stories about resilience, about justice, about ordinary people finding the courage to stand up for themselves and reclaim their lives. These are stories about real emotions, real struggles, and real triumphs. Stories that remind us all that no matter how difficult things get, there is always hope on the other side. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, so you never miss a new story and become part of a community that believes in the power of second chances, the importance of self-worth, and the beauty of finally being seen. Thank you for listening, thank you for being here, and thank you for allowing me to share Kimberly's story with you. Until next time, remember this: you are worthy of love, you are worthy of respect, and you are worthy of living a life that reflects the incredible person you have always been, whether or not anyone else has taken the time to notice. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.